This is our 5th cemetery tour that the Oxford Northeast Oakland Historical Society and Museum that we have hosted. And so today I'm not sure if it's 8 or 9, but we have founders that we're going to talk to people about, and it's a chance to meet who made Oxford what it is today. I was born on March 1st, 1933 in Monroe County, New York. My folks were Joseph and Emily Ferguson. I was barely 12 months old when my parents decided to move west to Michigan. We settled on property near Stony Lake in 1835, and you realize that's before Michigan was even a state. My parents often told stories of how hard pioneer life was and what a wilderness it actually was in Michigan. Well, my husband, whose name is on the stone on the other side here, was the second son of 7 sons, Mr. John Clark Moyer. He was also born in Monroe County, New York on May 7, 1819. But our paths never crossed in New York, so if you can do any math at all, you realize he's 14 years older than he was. His folks headed to Michigan when he was 6. Mr. Henry Moyers and his wife Margaret were farmers, and Mr. Moyers was also a blacksmith. That was a very critical skill back in those days. My father-in-law brought his family west with a wagon and a team. They brought their farm utensils and household furniture to the first stop, which was Buffalo, New York. There they booked passage on the side wheel steamer Superior. It was the second steamboat ever to be on the upper Great Lakes. When the Moyers family arrived in Detroit, their father purchased a yoke of oxen and cows. They followed the Indian Trail from Detroit through Royal Oak and Rochester to Romeo, where on a previous trip Mr. Moyer's father had purchased 160 acres of farmland. So there you have the foundation of our brave families and how they made it here to Michigan and Oxford. Education was very important to my husband's family, and that was not always common back then when you raised, you had farms and that. They didn't hold much store to it, but his family did. And my husband started school when he was about 10 years old, and he went to school until he was 18. Now, when we say that, that was only 4 months a year that they went to school, because they had to work on the farm. You had to have the hands of your kids to help run those farms. But when my John was about 20 years old, 1839, June 24th to be exact, he set out on his own and he purchased 120 acres near my folks' farm in Oxford Township. You might not realize it's quite a trek from Romeo to Oxford back then. That was no easy trek. And at that time, there was only one single log cabin in the village of Oxford.
It's hard to believe.
It's hard to believe. I won't go into the details of how we met, but I'm sure you can figure it out. Little bitty town, not many people here, one house. He bought property next to my folks. He proposed. I was only 18 and beautiful, of course. And I said yes, so he robbed the cradle. He was 32 years old. Now we go, wow. And that was really not uncommon back then. But if you think of some of the things that are today, it's not that. So We went to live on what would be
his first marriage, by the way?
yes,
Okay.
yes. We went to live on what we would later call the West Moyers Farm. Our family turned into 3 when our daughter Adela was born in October the following year. Our family quickly grew. By 1861, the start of the Civil War, we had 4 living children: Adela, John Charles, Belle Hortense, and Henry Dayton. Our dear second sweet child, George, died when he was 2. In 1862, we moved our family to the Stony Lake Farm, which was then made part of the Moyers property. So my folks and John, they combined their farmland, and we became the largest landowner in Oxford Township with 640 acres. The property extended from the shores of Stony Lake north to the north, and south it went all the way to the current village. We were soon employing a number of farm hands and servants to help me with the chores in the house. It was very hard work, but my husband was really smart. In addition to managing our family farm, Mr. Moyers was elected as Oxford Township Supervisor for several terms. He was one of the original trustees of the Oxford Institute and served on the school board for many years. He also became interested in the development of railroads. After observing the prosperity that followed a railroad line, he took his interest and his investments, and he became the director of the Michigan Airline Railroad. This was the east-west railroad line which passed through Oakland County towns of Milford, Commerce, West Bloomfield, Pontiac, Avon, and Rochester. We can't even go east-west today, so that was a pretty remarkable feat to have a train that covered those towns. Our farm was producing 1,000 to 2,000 bushels of wheat a year, so transporting our harvest to market became a real issue. So Mr. Moyers promoted and liberally aided in the construction of the Bay City line, and when it was completed in 1872, the Detroit Bay City line extended through Avon, Oakland, Orion, Oxford, and Thomas, which Thomas is no longer here.
That wiped out with the hurricane.
It did, in Oakland County. The Moyers Farm, it was a cyclone. We would call it a tornado today, but in my day we called it a cyclone. The Moyers Farm now had easily available transportation to get our goods to market, and Oxford became the center of commerce. So before those big gravel trucks, we had trains carrying farm goods. When Mr. Moyers passed away in 1878, I continued to manage all of our properties. With the assistance of my family, including my son-in-law, Ian Slayton, we were able to continue to run our business affairs. Our son, John C., died of heart failure in January of 1901, and my dearest oldest child, Adela, died of cancer that very same year. During my years of marriage to Mr. Moyers, I had gained a capacity for business that most women did not have. And despite these tragedies, I managed to carry the burden of the large property and kept it intact. I had practically lived on the same farm for 72 years, and that's until I moved into the village in 1907. When my son Henry Dayton Moyers passed on July 9th, 1908, I was in a practical sense the last of the Moyers family. All our children had passed without the gift of children of their own, and I was reunited with my family on November 22nd, 1909, when I died as a result of pneumonia. Our family name is still prominent in the village as Moyers Street. I'm sure many of you have seen that, and that is the result of our son John C. and his development in the southwest portion of the village.
I am the Honorable Samuel Axford III, the son of the Honorable Samuel Axford II, who served in the Michigan Territorial Government, and Rachel Morgan, the niece of General Morgan, who served in the Revolutionary War. My ancestors came from Oxford Township in Warren County, New Jersey, where my grandfather, Samuel Axford, lived and farmed 1,600 acres of land. In 1808, my mother and father left New Jersey and settled in Canada's Long Point district, about 165 miles east of Detroit along the shore of Lake Erie. That's where I was born on the 6th of August, 1809. I'm the eldest of 13 children. In 1822, my family and I crossed the Detroit River with the assistance of French oarsmen into Detroit, where American military occupation at Fort Shelby was coming to an end. Detroit at that time was still primarily a frontier post with significant occupation of trappers, fur traders, and American Indians who were involved in trade and bartering with the immigrants who were also settling there. My family and I traveled north from Detroit through the low-lying swampy terrain to Royal Oak and to Rochester before we settled in Shelby Township. It was in Shelby that my father signed the petition to organize Macomb County, and in 1835 he became the territorial supervisor there. Shortly thereafter, he attended the convention in Ann Arbor to establish Michigan's credentials for statehood. His drive and determination, coupled with his admirable dedication to public service, is what influenced my own desire to enter public office. I left home in 1833 and settled here in North Oakland County on 160 acres of land I purchased from the government, where the Territorial and Metamora roads intersect just north of here. I was only the third settler to this area. My closest neighbor was Eldridge Deming, just down the hill. He was the first recorded settler here. 2 years after my arrival, I met and married Miss Phoebe Summers of Macomb County, and we would have 8 beautiful children together. When the first town meeting was held, I, along with Mr. Otis Thompson and Mr. John Rossman, were chosen to serve on the committee to select a name for the settlement. We had many options before settling on Oxford. Some folks think we chose this name because so many of us farmed and we had teams of oxen to work our land, but I think that's a bit far-reaching. Others speculated that it represented the mispronunciation of my family name, Axford. But do you really think that I would let that happen? Some even believe that it originated from our sister city back in England. But we really didn't have a strong relationship with them at that time, so I think that might just be coincidental. Perhaps most coincidental is that most of us came from Oxford, New Jersey. I think maybe that might have something to do with it. Being a farmer has been good, respectful path of life. Aside from working the land, my brother Morgan and I entered into business together in about 1844, which proved to be quite successful. We sold farm implements. It was really service to community that became my calling, though. Probably because my late father's dedication to it, and because my brother lost his life on the 7th of November in 1847 while fighting the Mexican War. A war that ended in treaty signing only 4 months later. After the war, there was a westward push for expansion, discovery of land, and the anti-slavery free soil movement. I know my brother served honorably and not without sacrifice, something I greatly admire. Public service is in my blood. It proved to be my calling, and I suspect it's the reason why you wanted to meet with me today. I held nearly every public office in this township, and I was involved in assisting the organizational efforts. But in 1841, I was elected to the state legislature to serve as in the House of Representatives and to represent you. It was my constituents who elected me there with such compassion and admiration that they demanded that I serve them once again. So I stepped up and served as your state senator. I became the unanimous choice at the convention that year and was honorably elected to serve as state senator in 1851. Really, for the most part, except for my term as Justice of the Peace back here in Oxford, I was able to move out of the public life and back to my farm to retire. I guess if I wanted my legacy to be remembered for future generations, I could only hope that it would be a man of integrity, a man who loved his family, who loved his wife, and someone who wasn't afraid of a challenge or a little hard work or dirty hands. Someone who placed the well-being of his fellow townsmen above that of his own interest and needs. A humble and honest man, the Honorable Samuel Axford III. So the Honorable Samuel Axford III went to be with the Lord in May of 1882 at the age of 73. His beloved wife, Phoebe, would join him nearly 1 year later, almost to the day, in May of 1883.
My name is Sally Demings. I am the second wife of Elbridge Demings. He was born in 1800 in Sharon Springs, Vermont. He married very early, and sadly his first wife died very quickly. Well, he was grief-stricken, so he headed west, which young men tended to do in those days. Excuse me. When he got to Chloe Center in New York, he bought the very first land purchased in Oxford Township. We were up the Indian Trail, which I think now you call M24, but we were up there with the Metamora Crossroads, and that's where our property was. Well, he stayed a little longer than we had planned because he met me, and we got married, and we stayed there for about 4 years because we had our first child there. When we finally set out to head west and continue the quest and find our land, we made it as far as Detroit, and we stayed there for another year, and our second child was born. So we stayed in Detroit for about 4 years. When we finally headed west again, we made it as far as Pontiac. Actually, we were in Detroit for 1 year, Pontiac for 4 years. Then Mr. Demings, because I had the children, set out on foot on the Indian Trail to find our land in Oxford Township. And when he got to our land, we had a cedar swamp. We called it the Cedar Swamp property. He discovered a friend of his was already there, Avery Brown. They were friends in New York. Mr. Brown was here shooting wolves for bounty. And that's how he was making his money. He was also making cedar shake shingles from the cedar swamp because he knew a lot of people would be coming this way and wanting to build homes. And he was very right, obviously. So Mr. Avery Avery Brown let us stay in his very rustic cabin with him for a while till we got a chance to build things and build our own rustic cabin. So we carried on. We had 2 more children. We started working the land. We made everything ourselves, very limited supplies because we couldn't get back and forth between the trade centers. So we made our own soaps and candles and, of course, all our own clothes. We spun a lot of wool in those days. We planted gardens. We were very fortunate that we had a fresh spring and swale on our property, so we always had fresh water. Mr. Demings decided he wanted to dig a proper well. So he did so with the help of one of the Indians. Now, being on the Indian Trail, we had a lot of Indians going up and down the trail all the time, and while they weren't particularly friendly, they weren't overly hostile either. So we just kind of coexisted. Well, when they were working on the well, Mr. Demings was talking about wanting to plant corn. And the Indian who was working with, who perhaps had already had a bit of the corn, suggested that the white man could plant the corn, but the Indians were going to harvest it, which made Mr. Demings very uncomfortable. So it was an uneasy existence. Not too long after that, he was out in front of the cabin with about 10 Indians. They were planting and splitting wood and cutting rails and such. And one of the Indians suddenly picked up his musket and took a shot point blank at my husband. Well, luckily the musket misfired, but he wasn't happy about that. He ran into the cabin. He was going to get his gun, and I talked him out of it. But they didn't need an incident like that. Let's just settle. So he finally settled down, and the Indians left quietly. So we didn't have a major incident, thank goodness. But time went on. We eventually built our own, got our barn built, because the barn is always more important than the house. And a neighbor of ours, Allenson Decker, also needed a barn. So they hired a crew from the pier because there weren't enough people in this area yet to put together a crew to raise a barn. And they built our barn in the morning and Mr. Allenson's barn Mr. Decker's barn in the afternoon.
Wow.
and they were beautiful, sturdy barns. Now more people were starting to come into the area, the Shippies and the Rossmans, and of course the Axfords. You know, when Mr. Axford finally built his Dutch colonial up on the hill, he told everyone around that he wanted to be able to look down our chimney. To this day, I don't know why he wanted to look down our chimney. But he did. He built his big house. In 1835, we finally built our frame house. Finally had a proper home with glass in the windows and rugs on the floor. It was lovely. So we carried on. We had a good life here. As more people were coming into town, of course, things like mail delivery became important. So the first post office was in our home because we were the first ones there. Do you know what the price of a first class stamp was then?
Penny.
25 cents.
Really?
So you had to have some really important news to be prepared for it to travel, and cost 25 cents. People complain about the rates today, I understand. It's still a problem. But being the first in the area, we also had a lot of lodgers, people walking the trail, going up to their property and exploring between here and further. So they tended to stay with us. We never intended to open a tavern or a hostel. But people would go out of a place to lay their heads for the night and have a hot meal. And some people paid, some people did chores. But it was very social. We had the first school. We have established a small school. And we also held our church services there. Sometimes there wasn't a preacher available, so one of the men would get up and read a Bible verse, and we'd all sing. And it was important to us, that sense of community. So once... This is all new to me. I don't even know what's going on. So one of the being the first in the area, we had a lot of firsts. And the biggest one was we got a pair of draft horses and a big, heavy wagon. And everybody thought, no, that was such a luxury, until they realized that they needed that too. So they borrowed. Mr. Demings was very generous, and he would lend out the horses and wagons for people's projects, and made it a little easier if he had to travel to get supplies. He could actually take what took him a month to walk, he could now do in about 10 days by wagon. He could get from here to Pontiac in 10 days. Yeah,
10 days?
10 days.
To Pontiac?
It wasn't that fast. Because we had the horses doing all the work then.
Are you sure? Because I thought a horse could go 20 miles a day.
But they were big draft horses pulling a heavy wagon.
Okay.
And you didn't want to overwork the horses. You always took better care of the horses than you did the people. They were more important. But we stayed here. We loved this area. When things started building up in what we called Oxford Corners, which I think now you call the village of Oxford, more people were building and setting up businesses down here and homes. So it wasn't as busy. So they eventually moved the post office. But in 1836, the first meeting to establish Oxford as an official township was held in our home, because that's where everything happened. And in 1837, Oxford officially became a township. And Mr. Demings was the second supervisor. The first supervisor, I don't recall his name, but he didn't live long. So as things moved further out, further down into a central location, things did get quieter. But we eventually were able to travel back to Vermont and to New York to see our families. But we always couldn't wait to get home because Oxford was home. So we came back, we watched our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren grow. Unfortunately, Mr. Demings passed away in February of '60. He was 59 years old, shy of his birthday.
Died of what?
I'm sorry?
What did he die of? I thought you said what he died
No, I said just shy of his 60th birthday. I'm sorry. But I stayed on the property. That was my home, and I got to continue to watch it grow, and more people come in, and more land be opened up, and with the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, and it was a very, very good life. It was hard work, but it was a good life. I ended up living to the age of 86, and I died in 1894. But it was a good life and a good place, and obviously it's still a good place because y'all are here. Do you have any questions?
Where's your headstone?
That little one back behind me?
Okay.
The women didn't get much play in those days. Yeah, it was the big one for the guys. Plus,
Maybe because he died first.
Yeah, he got the big one. But we also didn't have a lot of cash money. A lot of what we did was trading and bartering goods and services. So getting together a few dollars to go on a shopping trip to Pontiac or Detroit was a big deal. Because we just didn't deal with a lot of cash in those days. So, anybody else?
It's a remarkable story.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a remarkable place. And we were very proud to be the first ones here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking around today and a lot of my neighbors have come back. We'll get together later. We don't see each other that often anymore, so we'll have a little party tonight. Yes, we will. But again, I thank you all for coming because, as I said, if you weren't here, we couldn't come. So we'd like to make it back about once a year. So if you're interested, we may come back, or some of our other friends and neighbors may come back. You never know. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I am Lucia Van Wagner, and all these headstones back here are Van Wagner. So we had a very big family, so I kept notes. I didn't want to tell you the wrong thing. I am married to Jedediah Van Wagner. We had one child, and he only lived till he was 4. Jedediah is the son of Jacob Van Wagner, who is the son of Michael and Hannah Van Wagner, who started out in New York. And they had several children in New York, stayed there for a while, and then Father Van Wagner, Michael, came to Michigan to scope it out in 1820. But I'm going to back up a little bit. Father Michael Van Wagner was a veteran. He fought in the Revolutionary War, and then his son, Michael Jr., ended up joining the New York militia, and he fought in the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, Michael went back to New York, and he married Mary, and they ended up having 4 children, and they lived with Mom and Dad in New York. Can you imagine, as tiny as the houses were back then? It was Mom and Dad, a son, and 4 kids. Then in 1820, Dad came here, Michael Sr., to scope out the land values here in Michigan. In 1823, Jacob and Michael decided to start working on the Erie Canal. They decided they wanted it, before that it would take months to get to Michigan or anywhere west of New York. So they wanted to help move things along, and they ended up working on the Erie Canal. Well, Dad was here in Michigan. After that, in 1823, Jacob and Michael sold everything in New York and decided to come to Michigan. So they packed up lock, stock, and barrel, family, Mom, Dad, and kids to come this way. Unfortunately, Grandma didn't make it. She died along the way. But they got here, and they ended up in what was Oakland Township, but now it's Rochester Hills. In 1825, a year later, Grandpa died, Michael, and so he was the first person to be buried in the Stony Creek Cemetery on Tinkin Road. That same year, Uncle Michael purchased 80 acres in Avon Township, and while there, they had some more kids. They ended up having 10 kids, and Jacob ended up having 9. He had 7 in New York, and then 2 more when they got here. So after they moved to Michigan in 1834, Jacob purchased 160 acres in Area 18 of Michigan, of Oxford, which is east of M24. What we know is M24 right now. After they bought that property, the rest of the family came from Avon Township, and pretty soon they have a whole neighborhood. They all built houses next to each other, and they ended up establishing pretty much the town. And from what I understand, there's still Van Wagner's here, and at one point they owned many, many houses along Denison Avenue, or Denison Street. In 1842, however, Uncle Michael moved to Brandon with one of his sons, and they purchased a cattle ranch. However, one night he's looking for his cattle, and he could not find his way home. And at that time, there were a lot of Indian trails, so he was following an Indian trail, but ended up having to shelter in a hollow tree, and then followed the Indian trails in the morning and ended up at the Seymour cabin, where the family found him. Like the brothers, their descendants served in public office in defense of our country. Most notable relative was Murray Van Wagner, who was the 38th governor of the state of Michigan. After that, we had plenty of people protecting our country, family. George Erastus, Milton, William Van Wagner, all enrolled in the 14th Michigan Volunteer Infantry during the Civil War, and descendants Lou Van Wagner served during World War II, the Korean War, and the Cold War, and during his service, he rose to the ranks from buck private to general, brigadier general. So we're pretty proud of what our family has done for this country. We're pretty proud that our family still has remained here in Oxford, and I hope you enjoyed their story. Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Libby Burdick Hudson. My father was the doctor here in Oxford, one of the very first doctors. And when he moved here from New York, he was born in New York until he was about 19, and then moved to what they call Deming's Quarters, which is, much as I can figure out, is kind of up by Metamora. And he was with another doctor, Dr. Pliny, and they stayed there about 3 years, and then Dr. Pliny moved back to Detroit, and Dr. Burdick moved into Oxford at Oxford Quarters. So the Burdicks actually owned the land that is now called the Hudson Edition. Okay, I wanted it to be called the Burdick Edition, but because it was Hudson Street, they called it the Hudson Edition, although my husband was very glad, since his last name was Hudson, that it got named after him. My father also helped build the first tavern. It was the first wood frame building in Oxford, and it was Powell's Tavern for a while, and then it became the Stanford Hotel, and then it became the Oakland Hotel. It is now the Oxford Flea Market. So that is where he was. Then on the south side of Burdick is where the Burdicks lived, and there was also a building, a 3-story building, and I think it's really interesting that we know it was 24 by 62. Not sure why that was an important stat, but it is. It was 3 floors though, so it was one of the taller buildings in the Oxford area. And there was a store on the first floor, an attorney on the second floor, and on the third floor was a social hall where they had meetings, weddings, things like that, and it actually would hold 400 people. Wow. So that was the social hub, that part of Oxford, which is today still part of the social hub in that area. My father had 4 children, and he married, his wife's name was Eliza. 3 of the children are buried here, and even though he was a doctor, we sort of get a sense of what medical care was like then, because their 2 little boys both died as children. And my sister Charity is buried here, and I believe I'm buried in Rochester, where we ended up when I died. But my mother and father and the other 3 children are all here. When my husband moved here, he came from Rochester, and he opened a dry goods store. And one of the things that I found kind of interesting is that as I look up dry goods stores, I can't really find ours named anywhere. I find lots of dry goods stores, but I can't find the Hudson one. So, but he had a dry goods store here for a long time. And then after my parents died, we moved back to Rochester and opened a grocery store, and ran a grocery store there for a long time. And then he became a traveling salesman, and at that point I sold the Burdick Hudson subdivision and added it to the town. After I died, he still kept the store in Rochester and got remarried, and I don't know what happened to the rest of them. But it was really interesting to see how Burdick is named after him. Obviously the Burdicks and Hudsons had a lot to do with getting the town going and building It was, they said that the first frame building, which actually ended up being 2 hotels, they did it with something that I don't understand called math flats, and it meant that they cut strips of lath, and that's what they built. But it must have been pretty sturdy because it lasted several generations. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Clemens. I am the widow of John Clemens, and I'd like to share with you the story of my family. I was born in 1848 in New York, and we moved here. I am 174 years old, so bear with me in case I forget something. The Clemens family also came from New York, and they were well known in Oxford when we arrived. My father-in-law was Ambrose Clemens. He owned and operated a foundry that produced cast iron for farm implements and tools. He never aspired to political honors, but he was elected constable in 1843. He also accepted the honor of being the justice of the peace. So when there were problems in town, he was often called upon to quell disturbances. On one such occasion, a bunch of ruffians just took possession of a hotel here in town. The owner summoned Mr. Clemens. He went into the bar and asked him kindly to leave. Someone hit him in the back of the head. He grabbed the assailant and pitched him out the door. They all left. The assailant later attributed his change of attitude to the counseling of Mr. Ambrose Clemens. The Clemens family lived at the Hovey Tavern. They built their home on the west side of Washington Street in 1843. The house and the barn were located where Denison Street is today. It went back for a number of acres toward the west. It was called the Denison addition to the village of Oxford. The barn road is still there today where Denison Road is. My husband John Clemens was born in that house in 1845. Things were not easy for the Clemens family ever. His older brother George died at just 15 years of age on August 15, 1852. Mrs. Clemens, my mother-in-law, was also named Mary. Mary died just 4 years later. My husband John, was just 10 years old when he lost his mother. And Ambrose, the father, was injured while working with metal in his blacksmith shop, and he suffered an infection in his hand that left his arm useless. And he had to, due to his family health, he had to close his business, and he moved to Metamora. As a young man, my husband John started working around Metamora. He lived with a family by the name of Davison, and he began training with Mr. Davison to be a blacksmith like his father. The family's fortunes continued with the death of another brother. William Henry Clemens was a Union soldier. He was killed in the Battle of Fair Oaks in May of 1862. We called it the War of Rebellion. We know it as the Civil War. In the meantime, John married me, Mary Lorette Blanchard. John went into business at his father's former blacksmith shop, which was still located on Washington Street. He was not yet 20 years old. In 1865, the business became the Oxford Carriage Shop, and we manufactured carriages and phaetons. And back then, carriages had to be painted, so we decided to sell the paints we used. This sign was found in a house, you could take it if you want. It was remodeled on Pontiac Street, and at the bottom you'll see it says John Clemens Paint. So we sold our paint as well as used it for our wagons. And we were very happy in 1860. We had a son. We named him George after John's lost brother. We sent him to the best schools. He spent his summers working with his father in our shop. But tragically, our son, George, died August 11th, 1874, the same month at the same age as John's brother, George, his namesake. There's no greater sorrow than losing your child. I believe that's why John was known to many. A young boy in town, they would bring in their wagons or their bikes, and he would fix them for free for them. And I think that was to honor our son. John also employed his younger brother, James. James was 2 years younger. James was 2 years younger than John, and he died in 1871 at the age of 24. Their father, Ambrose, died later that same year at 66. They're both all buried near the cemetery. My husband John was elected village trustee in the second election for village officer. He was very strong and healthy man. He stood about 5'10". He weighed about 200 pounds. He was compactly built. He was very athletic. He could carry a man on his back just for the fun of it. He loved sporting and he loved wrestling. He loved swimming. He could swim for a mile. He was a jovial man. He was friendly. He was a good singer. But he never let vices interfere with his business. He was a great success at his business. And since he'd always been so fit, he was especially troubled to find out he was in ill health before he was 40 years old. He went south to Hot Springs, Arkansas, hoping to have his health restored by the therapeutic waters there. He was there just for a few weeks in March of 1884 when I was notified that he was dead. This turn of events was very shocking to me, as it did not seem that he was that sick. I sent an undertaker to claim and return his remains. Upon arriving in Hot Springs, the undertaker was told that Mr. Clemens had committed suicide. That was not true. The undertaker believed that everything clearly pointed to a case of murder. And just previous to being notified of his death, I had sent him money, and he acknowledged that he had received that money. The money was missing, as were his other personal values. His stopwatch was missing. He would never lose or give away his watch. He would never kill himself. And despite our protestations, the local authorities in Arkansas declined to make any further investigation into the circumstances of his death. Under those constraints, it was impossible to pursue our case from so far away. The questions still remain unanswered today. No accounting of his belongings could ever be made. My husband John was only 39 years old when he died in 1884. I had him returned to me. He was buried here in Oxford, our home. Because of the success of his business, I was able to lead a comfortable life. I returned to New York. I never remarried, and I missed my husband John and our son George every day of my life until I died in 1921, and we were reunited right here in the Oxford Cemetery.
Wow.
Thanks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Allow me to properly introduce myself. My name is Horace Hubby. Yes, you are correct in your thinking that Hubby Street in the grand village of Oxford, Michigan is named in honor of my family. So who am I? Well, a little bit about myself. I was born July 14th, 1805 in Albany, New York. My parents were Phineas and Prudence Hubby. Now my father, like many men at the time living on the Hudson River, became a contractor on the Erie Canal, which ties into my story. Because in 1826, I married the love of my life, Miss Hannah Scribner. She was 4 years my younger, born in 1809 in Otisville, Maine. In 1828, 2 years after we were married, we decided to leave New York and head west on the same Erie Canal that my father worked on. Now we were headed to the great territory of Michigama, which the Chippewa natives said meant big great, or big lake, or Great Lakes, later to be called Michigan. Okay? We took the William Penn steamer ship from Buffalo to Detroit. Now the William Penn was the 5th steamer on the upper Great Lakes at the time, which was a very, very big deal. Now we arrived in Detroit, and it was a bustling city. You see, in 1820, there were approximately 8,900 people in Michigan. By 1825, the Erie Canal was completed, and by 1830, there were more than 33,000 people living in Michigan. So like I said, Detroit was bustling and up and coming. But we wanted land, so we headed north. We got to Rochester, a very nice area with a very familiar name, as in Rochester, New York. But we kept going north until May of 1828. We arrived in Oxford, fell in love, and put down our roots. About a decade later, in 1837, the same year Michigan became a state, Oxford became a township. And I was present at the very first township meeting. And when the officers of the township were elected, I was elected to the office of constable. Ladies and gentlemen, standing before you today is Oxford's very first lawman, right? Now, our family grew with the birth of all 12 of my children, which was important because I was a farmer by occupation. But soon enough, an opportunity would present itself that I couldn't turn down. And I was able to acquire the second hotel in Oxford called the Oxford Exchange Hotel, built by Benjamin Knight in 1843. Now, my family worked hard at our farming business and our hotel business. In fact, at times we lived in our public house with our guests. Talk about 24/7 customer service, right? Now, let's see here. I sold the hotel in 1865 to Jacob Cole, and he renamed it the Cole Hotel. And from that point on, it went through a succession of new owners and name changes until, unfortunately, it burned down in the notorious Oxford Fire of 1877, which in fact took out the entire southwest business district of Oxford, including Tunstead Hardware, but it put in place new policy that all buildings in downtown Oxford had to be made of brick and stone and not just wood. Right? But enough about me and my endeavors. I want to talk about my family. Hannah and I loved and were proud of each and every one of our children. But we were especially proud of two of our sons, Horatio and Silas. Now, Horatio had been self-sufficient since the age of 14, and through his hard work and determination, he became one of the most prominent businessmen in the city of Muskegon. Everything from city commerce to school board of education. He was the president of the Muskegon Bank. In 1903, him and his wife Nellie built a beautiful Victorian home, which is still on display today, called the Horatio House. In 1867, 2 years after I sold my hotel, Hannah and I decided to move to Muskegon to live with Horatio. But 3 years later, my dear Hannah passed away. And I brought her back here to Oxford to have her laid to rest, where I would eventually join her, along with some of our children, Joseph, Daniel, Caroline, and Alban. Now, Daniel and Caroline both died as children, God rest their souls. Next, we have Silas. Silas married Sarah E. Glaspie, which I'm sure you're familiar with, as in Glaspie Street here in Oxford. Now, Silas owned a general merchandise store in downtown Oxford, and he also started a dry good business in Pontiac during the Civil War. Now, his business endeavors took him into the timber industry in the 1880s, and he owned thousands of acres of pine in Michigan and in multiple other states. He had a 4,000-acre stock and grain farm in Yellow Medicine, Minnesota. But what Silas is most known for is that he was one of the original co-founders of the Dime Savings Bank in Detroit, Michigan, 1884. In fact, the building still exists today. It's at the triangle between Lafayette, Griswold, and Michigan Avenue right there. Silas, further proving his leadership skills and abilities, he became the president of the Peninsular Salt Company, which, as I'm sure you're aware, prior to refrigeration, salt was very important in food preservation. Now, after Hannah passed away, I decided to move back to Detroit to live with my son Silas. And I was living with him in October of 1884 when I died. So I was brought back to Oxford to be laid to rest with my family in these old burial grounds. Now, my son Silas, he built a mausoleum right here behind us on the front of the hill. It's a Renaissance or a classical style mausoleum. He and Sarah are interned there. There's actually room for 6 interments, 3 on each side. It's an open vestibule for flowers or personal visits. And today, my family's name continues to be prominent by means of Hovey Street. And so I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to my family history. And I would ask that you think kindly of us anytime you pass by here or travel down Hovey Street. Because no matter where we sought our fortunes or what roads we traveled on, like many of you here today, we always considered Oxford to be our home. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your tour.
I'm Mary Graham Shipley, or Shippey. I keep saying Shippey. You might be familiar with Alexander Graham of Rochester. He is one of the first citizens of the Rochester area. Is that right, Bonnie? And his brothers James and him came to the Rochester area and settled. I came with my father, and my dad, Alexander Graham, fought in the Civil War and in the War of 1812. And I married John Shippey. We first moved to New York, and then we came to the Rochester area, and we settled there and had 6 children. Unfortunately, one of my sons died, and Benjamin's grave is the 7th from the end. He was 10 years old. Right now you have a lot of medicine that cures simple diseases. Wish those had been around then. My husband John was a millstone maker. Does anybody know what a millstone is? Well, back then, to get any grain turned into flour, you had to have two stones that didn't touch but almost touched. And the degree at what you would adjust your stones. You would get a coarse grind or very fine, like flour grind. And that type of work was very strenuous. John was a hard laborer. There are several stories about him getting apprentices, and none of them worked out. You had to be so physical to do this work. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with some of the mills that are around in our area. One mill in particular that I know that Oxford students go and visit is the Wilcox Mill over in the Romeo area. My husband had created the first millstones for that mill. He became so famous in the state of Michigan that he would travel as far in a horse and wagon to Grand Rapids, and he would make millstones for that area. We had several children, and just one thing I wanted to point out is if you look at all the headstones that are here, you'll see that all of them are my sons and my sons' wives. None of my daughters are buried here. It wasn't unusual for daughters to go to the son's family grave plot. And so this only represents the male side of my family. I have 6 daughters that are buried throughout the New York area. So thank you for taking the time today to come and visit my family at the cemetery. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hester Bargett Powell. My friends call me Hetty. I married William Powell in 1819, and he was born in New York on February 11th, 1795. And we lived in New York when our 4 sons were born. Their names were Joseph, Samuel, Thomas, and Francis, other known as Frank. In 1835, we decided to move west to Michigan. We lived in Detroit for a couple of years, and then we moved to Oxford Corners. Mr. Powell built a barn on our property in Oxford, and we lived in the barn for a time. We moved to Oxford because Mr. Powell thought it was halfway between Lapeer and the Rochester, Pontiac area, and it would be an easy ride on horseback for a day. In 1837, with the help of Dr. Burdick, my husband started to build a public house that we intended to live in and operate as a business. He was granted a license to keep the tavern because he met the standards that were set by the Oakland County Board. He had a good moral character. He had sufficient ability to keep the tavern and had accommodations to entertain travelers. And he was able to provide and care for 2 spans of horses. A span was 2 horses. So, in other words, 4 horses. The Powell Tavern was a temperance tavern. We did not sell spirits. Oxford Corners became the business center of the community. The post office was moved into our tavern from the Deming home, and Mr. Powell became the first postmaster in the village of Oxford. He also served in public office and was a township supervisor from 1841 to 1849. He served terms as township clerk and the justice of the peace. And we were members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. He passed away in 1854, and I sold the tavern to Mr. Parker. Mr. Parker sold it to Lovett and Harmon Stanton. It was then known as the Stanton House. The building was later stripped of all of its embellishments and moved to the property of Lovett Stanton's son Clarence on Burdick Street at the west end of the village. The original building site became the location of the new Oakland Hotel, which for many years was a well-known landmark. Our first grandchild was born, his name Horatio N. Powell, and that was to our son Joseph and his wife Mary. Joseph was elected supervisor in 1860 and again in 1870. And he was elected Oakland County probate judge in 1872 and served until 1877. He also financed the construction of the Oxford Opera House in 1874. He passed away in 1901. Our other son, Francis, better known as Frank, was our fourth son, and he volunteered and was commissioned as a captain in the newly formed 14th Michigan Volunteer Infantry during the War of the Rebellion. He was taken prisoner near Stone River. He was incarcerated as a prisoner and at the infamous Libby Prison, considered the second worst prison in the Confederate States. He was held in hopeless conditions until May 5th, 1863. After he rejoined the regiment, he was detailed to General Sherman's staff and acted as an escort for the general. He survived the Civil War and returned home and married a Miss Mary J. Bell. His son Frank was born around the same time that he died, in 1868. It was not uncommon for veterans for that war to die after their discharge as a result of the deprivations they endured during their service. During the years of my son's adult lives, I moved to Detroit and came to visit our family and the farm, often to escape for only a short time and then return to the convenience of the comforts of the city. When the Oxford chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, a Civil War veterans organization, was chartered, it was named the Frank Powell Post in honor of my son. The Powell family remains prominent in the village of Oxford today and is memorialized as the addition bearing the Powell family name and Powell Street.
You know, it's because of all of you that we're here today. It really is. We can't make it back on our